days of Elijah, declaring the word of the Lord.
Welcome to Love's Last Call with Evangelist Carol Ann of Agape Light Ministries. Please open your hearts to hear an anointed message that will encourage and empower you to walk in the love and light of God's Word.
Beloved, after setting the stage for our current series in Part 1, we'll pick up in Part 2 with our investigation of the first global component of the Antichrist, one world empire that we will be covering, and that is being advanced brick by global brick in revisited Tower of Babel formation, which is the governmental arm of this demonic edifice. Much of what is taking place is virtually unknown to the average citizen, even though it is hidden in plain sight, meaning that the agents of darkness do advertise their plans to some degree, but they never reveal the true intentions that are hidden behind their caring and persuasive facade. They propagate ideas and plans that they promote as being for the betterment of the world, when in fact their real agenda carries within it the complete control of the world and the people who occupy it. A striking example, and one we must pay attention to, is the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. With the most recent precursors or jump starters to this global endeavor being the recent UN Summit of the Future, where they adopted the UN Pact of the Future, and which is working hand in hand with other agencies, such as the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and others, in order to pave the way for the final worldwide takeover that will eventually be headed up by the Antichrist. The WEF, or World Economic Forum, as part of their Sustainable Development Impact meetings, wrote in an article entitled, "What is the UN Summit of the Future in 2024, and why is it important?" That the United Nations Summit of the Future, which was held on September 22nd to the 23rd, 2024, called together world leaders who adopted a pact for the future that includes a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations. It comes as the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Development Impact meetings drive action toward the UN Sustainable Development Goals. After 9 months of negotiations, world leaders have agreed on a landmark pact for the future at the UN General Assembly's Summit of the Future in New York. The pact consists of 56 actions designed to turbocharge the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but in particular to speed progress on issues around peace and security. And please do not miss that phrase, beloved, as well as global governance, climate change, digital cooperation, human rights, gender, youth, and future generations, end quote. In a commentary by Alex Newman entitled New UN Pact for the Future, Turbocharges Globalism, he gives us a glimpse behind the curtain of lying persuasions, where the global realities that are being accomplished and pushing forward with darkened dedication are at work. He writes, United Nations, governments, and dictators from around the world gathered in New York and adopted a sprawling agreement to expand and further empower the United Nations. The controversial declaration approved by the UN General Assembly, known as the Pact for the Future, is seen by the UN and its member governments as a great leap forward for the cause of globalism. In short, the UN is becoming UN 2.0, as top leaders of the organization put it. However, in the United States at least, lawmakers, governors, and grassroots leaders are growing increasingly restless about what they perceive as a historic power grab, putting many attendees at the UN summit on edge as Donald Trump prepares for a possible return to the White House. UN General Assembly President Philemon Yang of Cameroon claimed that The UN deal would lay the foundations for a sustainable, just, and peaceful global order for all peoples and nations. Other leaders of the organization echoed the sentiment. According to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, former leader of the world's preeminent alliance of socialist and communist political parties, the UN Summit of the Future represents an essential first step toward making global institutions more legitimate, effective, and fit for the world of today and tomorrow, end quote. Transforming, which really reads empowering, the UN with vast new authorities and responsibilities has been one of the major focuses of the massive gathering and is woven into the Pact. We can't create a future for our grandchildren with systems built for our grandparents, continued Guterres. A line that was printed out on giant signs throughout the UN headquarters as delegates discussed reform of the powerful UN Security Council, with a goal of eventually eliminating veto power of the permanent members. The final agreement adopted at the Summit for the Future formalized those ideas with the backing of virtually every national government and dictatorship on Earth. We recognize that the multilateral system and its institutions, with the United Nations and its charter at the center, must be strengthened to keep pace with a changing world, reads the Pact for the Future, which was adopted by, in quotes, consensus that featured only token opposition from a handful of governments. The Pact adds, we renew our commitment to multilateralism and international cooperation. We will transform global governance and strengthen the multilateral system, end quote. According to the document, only more globalism can handle the real and imagined problems facing humanity. A recommitment to international cooperation based on respect for international law is, in quotes, required, with international cooperation, like multilateralism, serving as a synonym for globalism. This is not an option, but a necessity, end quote. In fact, the agreement specifically claims that nations and their governments cannot possibly handle the alleged problems that face humanity without the UN. Our challenges are deeply interconnected and far exceed the capacity of any single state alone, the Pact states. They can only be addressed collectively through strong and sustained international cooperation. And again, end quote. The term global governance, often used as a less ominous placeholder for global government, is mentioned repeatedly throughout the document, always as something positive to be advanced. Under the heading Transforming Global Governance, for instance, the Pact calls for a dramatic expansion of these mechanisms for governing all of humanity. One of the institutions that received a shout out is the would be Global Supreme Court, known as International Court of Justice, often ridiculed by critics as a kangaroo court. We will fulfill our obligation to comply with the decisions and uphold the mandate of the International Court of Justice, the Pact states. Another area where the UN hopes to expand its power is on taxation, vowing to explore options for international cooperation on taxes, and in particular on taxing high net worth individuals. We are committed to strengthening the inclusiveness of tax cooperation at the United Nations, the UN deal explains, one of many efforts to eventually implement global taxation. Ultimately, though, globalism must expand across the board. We will take action to strengthen and reinvigorate multilateralism and to deepen international cooperation, it continues, offering unwavering commitment to international law for dealing with supposed challenges. A transformation in global governance is essential to ensure that the positive progress we have seen across all three pillars of the work of the United Nations in recent decades does not unravel. We will not allow this to happen, end quote. However, as highlighted by the New American in another article, the UN recognizes that humanity, and especially American taxpayers who pay the bulk of the bills, are growing weary of the UN. We must renew trust in global institutions by making them more representative of and responsive to today's world, and more effective at delivering on the commitments that we have made to one another and all people, the agreement reads. One of the major tools to help the UN renew trust in globalism is controlling information, as the Pact makes clear. It calls on governments to address so-called disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, and content inciting harm, including content disseminated through digital platforms. Of course, hate speech was a term introduced into the UN lexicon by the mass-murdering Soviet dictatorship to describe speech it hated. We will work together to promote information integrity, tolerance, and respect in the digital space, governments vowed in the UN agreement, followed by a dizzying array of actions they intend to take. We will strengthen international cooperation to address the challenge of misinformation and disinformation and hate speech online, and mitigate the risk of information manipulation in a manner consistent with international law. And once again, end quote. It is not just restricting information that counters the UN narrative. A confidential memo sent to communications executives across the UN system earlier this year, and obtained by the New American magazine, included provisions on how to propagandize humanity on the Summit of the Future and to its agenda. The Summit of the Future is a pivotal moment on our agenda, the memo stated, adding that the UN Department of Global Communications wants to make sure that we take the media with us, starting briefs on specific parts of the agenda. One way the UN has done that is by partnering with Google to hide information contrary to its narratives, especially on issues as climate. One of the major paragraphs in the final agreement, inked this weekend, involves the UN response to what it describes as complex global shocks. These could be anything from climate issues or economic problems to environmental crises, or even unpredictable black swan events. Under a proposal outlined in a policy brief dubbed Our Common Future, released by UN boss Guterres last year, Guterres himself would essentially become a global dictator to deal with real or imagined international emergencies declared at his discretion. And I interject here, beloved, perhaps a forerunner to the Antichrist. The proposal called for nations, businesses, and all sectors of society to recognize the primary role of intergovernmental organs, such as UN agencies, in decision-making, end quote. A key theme of the Pact was reaffirming commitments to previous UN agreements and schemes such as the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In particular, the UN Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, a recipe for global tyranny, adopted in 2015 as the Master Plan for Humanity, was a focal point of the New Deal. We reaffirm our enduring commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals, the new agreement states, vowing to urgently accelerate its implementation with concrete political steps and more tax money, end quote. And this is where we must pause for now, beloved, as we sort through everything I just shared with you, which in some ways sounds like a legal brief. The takeaway is this. Under the superficial pretenses of wanting to make this world a better and safer place for the people of Earth to live, the global elitists who are actually serving Lucifer, whether they know it or not, are working diligently toward a one world order that is eventually going to be taken over by the Antichrist and his totalitarian rule during the 7-year tribulation period, just as the prophetic word of God has alerted us will happen, and which is unfolding before our very eyes. And in our next segment, God willing, we will continue to investigate some of the other efforts taking place, such as the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, that are converging and bringing us closer to the rapture of God's true church, which, according to Scripture's outline, must happen before the tribulation period begins, with the main purpose for our exercise being to ready the people of God for the things that are taking place now and those things that are soon to happen, with the call of readiness in discernment and Holy Spirit power. And so, until next time, I leave you with Romans 13:11. And this do, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. And as always, beloved, I bid you his agape.
You've been listening to Love's Last Call with Evangelist Carol Ann of Agape Light Ministries. If you have a prayer request, please contact us at Agape Light Ministries, P.O. Box 6313, Chesterfield, Missouri 63006, or via our website at www.agapelightministries.com. Again, that's www.agapelightministries.com.